everybody. This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel. Welcome back to Echoes of War. I'm here with my co-host Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Greg, great to be here. And I think it's been a while since we've actually returned to the Pacific War. And I'm looking forward to finishing the series that we unfortunately got detoured in time with.
Yeah, certainly. So, for the audience's perspective, as you might not have noticed, we probably have not talked about the Philippines for about a month or more because we just covered the entire Greco-Persian Wars with our friend Dan. Excellent series. I really do recommend checking it out on YouTube. It's going to be it's going to be a full documentary put on the YouTube channel or perhaps on another channel coming soon. And yeah, we putting a lot of effort into the visualizations, adding portraits, a lot of maps, and even clips to our content. So please check us out on YouTube. And before we jump into this episode, I just want to say if you'd like to further support the channel, consider checking out the YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series. And I think I just made episode 35, which is a complete logistical look at the Guadalcanal campaign. It's a little bit more catered to the real history geeks, more so than the general audience, but
Me,
I think it's interesting. Yeah,
I
exactly.
love, I love talking about the logistics of war. It's such an underappreciated thing. I
Yeah,
want to just
exactly.
add one interesting
Mhm.
fact. If you see World War II propaganda, they talked quite a lot about the logistics, show like both sides showcasing their leaders and industrialists in factories with the tanks, everything. Today, it's kind of like that forgotten art to the general
Yeah,
audience. So I
yeah,
really
that's
hope
true.
people enjoy this episode.
Yeah, and so there's a lot going on over there. Of course, there's also early access, to all the content I make. For example, I have an anime review of an anime film called Cocoon that's been up there for 2 weeks, and I'm now currently editing part two in a series I did a while back, looking at how Japanese anime depicts the Pacific War, which I think it was one of my most successful episode I've ever put out, probably. So yeah, a lot of people want to see that one. It'll be coming out soon, but you can get early access probably in a few weeks. And of course, you get voting rights for what subjects I'll tackle next. It's not just me throwing out like four options all the time. I'm looking for feedback. I'm looking for ideas from the audience, and a lot of the times they turn into episodes, if not series. Like my entire series covering General Kanji Ishiwata was just a guy on my Patreon who asked me to cover it. Turned into a four-part series. So yeah,
Might also
that's all
add
that.
that I convinced you to do a history of the biggie.
Yeah, and that was a two-parter. That one was long, and I mean, it goes without saying the history of Big E. I mean, it's what the ship that saw the most service actions in history. Maybe I don't know. Is there any other ship that
I
has
think
done more?
by I think by U.S. Naval honors, I think the first Enterprise carrier, 20 battle stars, Navy Medal, and President Citation Award, which no other ship even comes close to having all of that.
Yeah, that's why she's
And also
loved.
was reported sunk like what, three times, four
Yeah,
times?
and that's why Roddenberry made it the Enterprise in Star Trek. Yeah, he was a big fan. Anyways, carrying on. So this is actually going to be, I think it's episode 4 or 5 in our series on the Battle of the Philippines, or better said, the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Because if you look up the Philippines campaign, usually Google will bring you to the 1944, 1945 part of it. So not to confuse everybody. But before we jump into it, I am going to put up a map just to bring us up to date. All right, here we go. So to catch everybody up, if you're just coming into this and you don't remember the last episode, we're entering February of 1942, and the defenders of Bataan have been pushed back to the Ariane-Bagan line. Now, the defenders of this line had managed to hold their ground after, repeated attacks, but malaria and dysentery is running rampant amongst the troops. And, by the battle's end of Bataan, the supply of quinine pills would be completely exhausted. These are pills to help with the symptoms of malaria, by the way. Over 10,000 American soldiers find themselves confined to field hospitals. Food rations are dwindling to about 50%, leading to the slaughter of the 26th Cavalry's horses for sustenance. The same unit that would perform the last cavalry charge of World War II for the Americans, that
And
is. And I think it's the last
just
American cavalry charge.
yeah, I was just gonna add, and say, as we iterated in the previous episodes, Bataan was supposed to be a holdout for about 50,000 soldiers and people at most, with 6 months of supplies, if properly executed per the established war plans. And unfortunately, in the chaos, not enough supplies was brought over. I think it's including the non-combatants here. It was almost 100,000 American and Philippine personnel on the peninsula. So
Yeah, it
the
was
supply
like
situation
what?
was really dire.
Yeah, 3 to 5 times the population they thought they'd be having within the area, and a dramatic reduction of the supplies that they were supposed to have. So it's a very dire. It was a dire situation from the very beginning, and it was one that could have been avoided. But you can watch episode 1 to learn about that. The Japanese forces, they're facing kind of similar hardships. General Homa, who's a very emotional commander, is in quite a lot of despair because his amphibious assaults that led to the Battle of the Points resulted in significant losses for the Japanese units. It was quite humiliating, honestly, and it's kind of this repeating thing with him and his command. A breakthrough in the Orient
And not
Bagat
to
line.
mention, he was not really liked by Imperial Army High Command.
Mm-hmm.
And a certain very famous person that you dislike, Mr. Suji Masanobu.
Yes, he's
But
involved
because I
here.
think,
Yes.
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Hama, I think midway when they entered the Bataan Peninsula at the start of this campaign on this here, right after he secured the main island of Luzon, or rather, what was left of it. Sorry, the majority of it. He realized his casualties were too much, and he actually had to request reinforcements, which really annoyed the Southern Army Command, because the
Mm-hmm.
entire series of operations across uh, the Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines was supposed to not go beyond 12 divisions, I think.
Yeah. Out of 53 total divisions at the end of 1941, they had 12 or 13, depending. I think it was actually a total of 13 divisions left to do the entire Asia Pacific onslaught for the 6 months there. And he was delaying the time schedule, which was not okay because this was a very complex, unbelievable like invasion operation across
It was
multiple
multiple
theaters. Yeah,
operations, yeah.
it's
And
insane. Yeah,
each operation is like several divisions, except Hong Kong, which was just operated by one division. And
yeah. Hong Kong was a
ultimately,
pretty
all of
small
them,
one. Yeah,
and ultimately, they all had to get to the Dutch East Indies because that was the key objective. It wasn't Singapore, it wasn't Malaysia, it wasn't the Philippines. It was the Dutch
you know
East
that.
Indies, or what we know
Now
as
that you
Indonesia
bring it
today.
up, you know what? After this one, I think we're going to do Hong Kong. It's been a while since I've done the Hong Kong campaign, and I have a lot of good notes from that since I'm a Canadian
I, I
after all and
just
stuff.
I just love the fact that their defense line was the gin
The
drinkers
gin
line.
drinkers line. I know you're going to bring that up. Yeah, yeah, everyone loves that. Hey, the Battle of Hong Kong is really overlooked, but it's one of the most brutal ones. Indians, Canadians, both of us got massively screwed over in defending Hong Kong. So many atrocities were committed against us. It's a brutal
Oh,
campaign. Yeah.
I'm definitely down for that. Let's definitely put in the pipeline.
All right. Well, back to the battle at hand. So the breakthrough on the Orient Bagan line had led to the Battle of the Pockets. However, despite enormous efforts from the Japanese, they were decimated. It was reminiscent of earlier outcomes, like at the Battle of the Points. Homa managed to extract about 378 soldiers from the debacle, and he was further humiliated. I mean, it's just another thing on his stained career. And this resulted, embarrassing the Japanese further. They had to withdraw several miles by February the 22nd. It was effectively destroying about three of their battalions of the 20th Infantry. It appeared that General Homa would fail to meet his original 50-day campaign target. And you always have to take into consideration there's others performing campaigns who are ahead of schedule. Obviously, I'm referring to General Yamashita. Uh, it really looks bad because if you look at every theater is going off basically without a hitch, except for Homa right now. So Homa looks glaringly incompetent. And Head HQ was definitely taking notice. There had been two minor victories in January and February that revealed, how well constructed defenses could be to thwart the Japanese flanking maneuvers. Yet this lesson, it eluded even General MacArthur, who was failing to grasp that the enemy's flanking efforts could be swiftly turned against them and used to encircle his forces. He was basically just relying on the same defenses he had been from the beginning. But by late February, the sickness rate soared alarmingly. Bataan was amongst, one of the most malaria-infested regions in the world, and the supply of quinine pills had completely been depleted. Stricken by malaria, hunger, and dysentery, over 500 men were hospitalized during the first week of March, prompting doctors to express, fears of a looming epidemic. There was a lot of discussions about, a mile-long convoy filled with supplies and reinforcements, which was just a myth that MacArthur kind of allowed the troops to. I mean, to be blunt, he was telling the troops that, there was, what do you call it? The rescue was on the way. They didn't really believe him. There was nothing coming. It was impossible for the decimated U.S. Pacific Fleet to even think about coming over.
But I do kind of also understand why he did it. It's at least his view of trying
Boost
to keep
morale,
morale up.
You have to. Apparently a lot of the Filipino soldiers believed him.
Okay, I know that,
Yeah.
but it's still,
Sad.
if you knew what was going on, and you would be hard pressed. But I guess you got to keep that hope going, no matter
Yeah.
what.
And
I think
at this,
if
yeah.
I think if in the Aleutian Islands campaign video you mentioned, right? I think when the US divisions were attacking, the Japanese were so battered, but they still kind of held out to that hope of a rescue before their ultimate demise. I can't remember. I think it was a doctor's notes that you were referring to in that episode.
Yeah, I forget the name of the doctor. He wrote in his journal every single day of the plight of the front line and what he was seeing back in the medical facilities. And it's very thorough, the notes, and it really gives you like the flavor of what was the feeling amongst the troops. And there was this vain little hope that ships would have made it into the port to kind of sneak them out. And it was a complete blockade. There was never any chance the ships were to get in. So yeah, it's a similar situation, you could say. At this juncture, war correspondent Frank Hewlett penned what has become an infamous little song about what happened to those poor guys in Bataan. And I'm not going to sing it, but I'll quote it right here. It goes like this. We're the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, no pills, no planes, or artillery pieces. And nobody gives a damn. So this is another famous lyrical piece that came from this battle alongside the one about Dugout Doug, Mr. General Douglas MacArthur. So it gives a little bit of a flavor as to what was going on. General Homa, he finds himself in a humiliating position of having to request for additional reinforcements from Tokyo. He has to do it again. Tokyo responded by sending reinforcements in the form of the 4th Division coming over from Shanghai, although its journey to the Philippines would be delayed due to ongoing operations in the Dutch East Indies campaign. They would eventually arrive on March the 15th. In the meantime, General Homa granted the men of the 16th Division and the 64th Independent Mixed Brigade some much-needed rest and relaxation. These units would have time to recuperate, and they receive about, 3,500 men and 60 officers each to replace those lost during the campaign thus far. Additional reinforcements would come from the Nagano detachment, led by Major General Nagano Kamichiro. I don't know if you had any notes on this individual.
Unfortunately, it's quite difficult to find any notes I can
Yeah, I would
translate also
imagine.
but he was the 21st Division's commander, right? He's been a major general since October of 1941, and he would later even reach the rank of lieutenant general, but that's like well towards the end of the war. Predominantly would be this was his, you could call it his last real command in the field, because afterwards he would be moved to reserve and staff roles.
Yeah,
The
that's
only
going to
major
happen under people under Homa.
Yeah, the only thing is he did arrange, which is later would be he would arrange for the surrender between the Japanese forces and the US forces led by Major General Edward King.
Oh, yes, of course.
That was I'm not going to get into that right now, but that's pretty much his greatest accomplishment.
Yeah. And for those curious, because I just remember it wasn't too long ago, we finished up the Pacific War week by week podcast series over at Kingston Generals. And one of the last episodes, I think it's 199 or maybe it's 200,
199.
is almost 99. It's exclusively about the numerous surrenders. I found it didn't make for that much of an interesting part of the podcast, but I went over basically every single theater and regional command and who they surrendered to and kind of the outcomes in that. So if you're interested in that, it gives a beautiful picture of like where all the Japanese holdouts were. That's for sure. People would be surprised at how many men were hiding out in all sorts of parts of the Asia Pacific.
Was it there like a soldier who did not surrender for like 30 years on Guam?
Yeah, so I think the last one was at Oda. It was like 75. He came out. Although even in the I have only limited time on those podcasts because it becomes too long if I put too many notes. But I don't know if I said it in it, but people were alluded to, oh yeah, he wasn't aware that the war was over. He actually totally knew the war was over. He admitted to it years after he had come back to Japan. He had been like fighting farmers and stealing their livestock for like 30 years, and he knew. He was afraid he was gonna have to face trials for war crimes and stuff. But
So he
yeah,
just became a bandit.
yeah, there's a bunch of them that was actually the case, and they would just pretend that they had no idea that the war was over. Yeah, but it was bullshit. But yeah, back to the story at hand. With these reinforcements, Homa now hoped, I mean, he probably prayed to overcome the defenders of Bataan. And at this critical moment, President Roosevelt went on to order General MacArthur to relocate from Corregidor to Australia. Yes. In actuality, it was Army Chief of Staff General Marshall's decision to do so, and it stemmed from Australian Prime Minister John Curtin. Eisenhower himself had argued that MacArthur was expendable, which is kind of funny if you think about it. Eisenhower had served under this guy. So, anyways, he knew what MacArthur was like. So, Eisenhower thought that MacArthur was expendable, but Marshall reconsidered and concluded the capture or the death of MacArthur would provide the Japanese Empire with one of the most potent propaganda campaigns of all time. And I completely agree with him.
I do get, and it's a bit crazy actually for Eisenhower to say that, because at
Yeah.
this particular moment, his official rank is still a colonel. He does not even reach the rank of major general as a permanent commission till 1943. He gets promoted to general, lieutenant general, major general, brigadier general, like up to the 4 stars on a temporary basis, but his formal commission is still that of a colonel at this moment in time.
Yeah. And
And
I like
it's a big thing to say that about a pretty senior commander.
and one that you served under, mind you. But to explain to the audience who might not be aware, you got to imagine, like for a moment, MacArthur has been in front of cameras. He's been reading propaganda pieces. I mean, it's like it would be insane. Like imagine the Japanese got their hands on him. Like today, we could think of it as ISIS or another terrorist organization getting their hands on a prominent member of the Senate or Congress in the United States, and they would have them like reading these things and these videos and all that. Like it would for MacArthur to be in that position, it would have been insane, and the Japanese absolutely would have done it. They did it with multiple other captured personnel. Arthur,
And this was a general who was very popular with the masses in the United States, and he did have a lot of political ambition.
yeah,
And that
of
is
course.
the only reason Roosevelt was never able to get rid of him, because we know Roosevelt did not like him.
Oh yeah, they hate each other.
But
Yeah,
he knew he could not get rid of him quite easily, and it took quite a lot. And I would even say this: it took quite a bit of political maneuvering in the Korean War to get rid of him by the Joint Chiefs.
yeah. It took one interesting decision on MacArthur's part to finally get canned. Let's say that much. A sea of nuclear waste, MacArthur. But yeah, as I've painfully already done too many times, I'm always seen as that YouTuber who just shits on MacArthur. The reality was, MacArthur, he had failed on numerous occasions during the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Like, this is really like a blemish to his career. But from the American public's point of view, he had emerged as like a rock star, some kind of godlike figure. And if he would have fell into Japanese hands, it would have been disastrous on the home front for morale for the troops. The new military and geopolitical significance of Australia could also not be overlooked. What if the Australians considered, an arrangement with Japan? This idea wasn't entirely far-fetched, given that Prime Minister John Curtin was evident in his anger towards Churchill, criticizing him for abandoning Australia pretty much in this situation. At this stage, America had not fully committed itself to Australia, and Britain's incompetence was becoming, increasingly concerning. As one Australian officer lamented at the time, the British Army had been forced back by a small Japanese army of only 2 divisions, riding stolen bicycles and without artillery support. Obviously referring to the Millennium
Bicycle
Campaign
blitzkrieg,
under General
folks.
Yamashita, the bicycle blitzkrieg. So, yeah, relocating MacArthur to Australia might serve to bolster Australia's commitment to the war, and definitely don't want MacArthur to fall into the hands of the Japanese. Others, too, were vocal about the necessity of rescuing MacArthur. Both the Republican Party in the United States and the New York Times urged for MacArthur's return from Corregidor. And to delve just a bit deeper, it's worth noting that MacArthur, from the onset of the war, was using his personal press entourage to cultivate his image, a tactic motivated by his aspirations for the White House. Initially, however, MacArthur resisted calls to relocate, claiming that rather than obeying the president, he would resign his position, cross over to Bataan, and fight alongside the men. Something he would absolutely say. He might have. He would. I'm not gonna say he wasn't a brave man. Yeah, if he wanted to go out, he'd probably go out like that. But he also knew that wasn't the best course of action right now. So he was going to escape. On March the 10th, General Wainwright would be summoned to Corregidor. But before I carry on anymore, did you have anything to say about General Wainwright?
Yeah, just one moment. So, General Jonathan Wainwright, he was the commander of the North Luzon forces. So, you could call him like he was the guy just reporting just under MacArthur in the planned defense of the Philippines. His initial defense force was on paper pretty large, which was 3 Filipino divisions and the 26th Cavalry Regiment. He, was a strong supporter of the War Plan Orange, but not MacArthur's active defense, which is what led to the mishaps that occurred at the start of the Philippine campaign. And he would be withdrawing to the Bataan Peninsula in January 1942 to defend the entrance to Manila Bay. And he's going to be serving as a Supreme Commander now. I mean, sorry, I spoiled it for you, Craig, but of the theater, because MacArthur is going to be taking over, like, go to Australia, where he'll become the commander of the Southwest Pacific area, and then prepare to fight his next enemy, the United States Navy. But Wainwright would go into captivity at the end, and was the highest because he was promoted to a rank of a lieutenant general on a temporary basis. He was the highest ranking US officer that surrendered during the war, and he was well respected because, while he suffered pretty brutally like any of the survivors, you know he was considered a fighting general by his men, willing to go down to the foxhole. And he did feel like for so long he let down the United States when he was actually received as a hero. He actually got his Medal of Honor in 1945 after release from captivity, which was awarded to him in 1942, but blocked by MacArthur. I'd add that the first time.
Yeah, I'll talk about that story a bit later. That's one that one pisses me off. That's a dirty one for another time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just adding that after the war, he would get the rank of a general of a 4-star general in the United States Army on 5th September, and would retire at that rank, full commission, not as
Full
a
commission,
temporary one.
as he deserves, having to spend the amount of time he did as a POW. It was rough.
Yeah,
You've
he
seen the
did.
pictures of him. He gets skinning.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's unfortunately I cannot find good quality images because the pixels they were just small image sizes. But he's a walking skeleton, like many of
Yep.
the survivors.
Yep.
I mean, he did fight for the men during the captivity to whatever extent he could to try to ease their conditions. Not very successful, but he's going up against like a steep wall or an impossible wall to climb at the very, to be honest.
Absolutely. Sutherland, informed him that MacArthur would be departing the following evening by torpedo boat for Mindanao. From there, a flying fortress would take him to Australia. Thus, General Wainwright was left in command of all the troops in Luzon as the head of the newly established Luzon force. Sutherland concluded by stating, "If it's agreeable to you, General Jones will receive another star and assume command of your First Corps." General MacArthur emerged from a small gray house at the eastern end of the Malenta Tunnel And he addressed Wainwright, saying that I'm leaving against my repeated protests. Of course I will, Douglas, was Wainwright's reply. MacArthur then assured him, and back. He then presented Wainwright with a box of cigars and 2 large jars of shaving cream, saying, Goodbye, Jonathan. The men shook hands. If you're still on Bataan when I return, I'll make you a lieutenant general. He pledged that to the poor man who was going to bear the entire fallout. Now, I want to just change from a map to a picture I found, which makes me kind of laugh my ass off. I don't know who painted this picture, but it seems to be what MacArthur thought it looked like when he left. Here, I'll zoom in a bit. So this is a rendition of, I guess, MacArthur's great escape to Australia, in which there was no danger. I don't know who drew this. It's
I
like
don't think the
overaction.
Japanese Navy, this is like what I could definitely see in a Commander comic.
Yeah. It's like it's so
But
ridiculous.
you're not gonna have like admirals or generals on that boat. You're just gonna have like a, you know, commander or some, like at most, or like corporal and sergeant.
Yeah. So the following evening, that's March the 11th, at around 8 p.m., PT 41, commanded by a colorful bearded lieutenant named John Buckley, took the Rock, which was the code name for MacArthur, along with his wife, his 4-year-old son, of course named Arthur, and most of his press entourage, as they should be called. And yeah, it's MacArthur's going to make this seem like it's a very daring escape. But so with him is of course his loser friend General Sutherland, who I don't like. His other personal entourage members, aide Sidney Huff, Brigadier and Intelligence Officer Spencer Kin, Captain Hugh Casey, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Marshall, Colonel Charles Willoughby, his press officer Lieutenant Colonel Legrande Pickdiller, and Colonel Harold George. All these men are going to be very important in the Australian Command. This group's actually going to be known as the Bataan Gang, and they would remain very loyal assistants to MacArthur throughout the rest of the war. One must never claim that MacArthur was disloyal to his staff. In return, they ensured that everything went the way MacArthur wanted it to go. They set out under the cover of darkness. Oh, yeah.
I really got to sometimes wonder, how did General Kruger survive?
Oh, yeah, I know. That's, well, General Kruger, I think at the beginning, MacArthur liked him.
Yeah.
They butted heads later, but I think at the beginning he was very liked. But yeah, Kruger is very underrated, like we said in our episode when we were covering
The best
generals.
best generals of the Pacific for the United States. Completely with you on that.
Yeah, criminally underrated. Yeah, he was a very, very fine commander, and he had to do, an assortment of different things that most
I think
army
the
generals would not have to do.
Yeah, I think the only other underrated general I would just say is, like, who's pretty good. I think maybe General Roy Geiger.
Yeah, absolutely. Also very underrated. Very unknown, too. People wouldn't know his command. Yeah. So they sent under the cover of darkness, speeding through tumultuous seas to Mindanao, while narrowly avoiding detection by Japanese destroyers. If you are watching us on YouTube, you see this hilarious painting of, like, as if his BT boats
escape.
Yeah, he's like right beside this like Japanese destroyer coming at him. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's like I can see like 5 boats, searchlights, aircraft. It seems like there's like fire going on in the background. This did not happen, but whatever.
Scroll up a little bit,
to
get to the top of the image.
Yeah.
But yeah. So you have the Japanese fleet carriers and, oh, great, a battleship or probably a heavy cruiser's just being blown up right now.
It's the entire Kido Butai is just here. MacArthur's sailing right through them. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, he's sailing through. MacArthur suffered chronic seasickness during their journey. He would describe it as a trip in a concrete mixer. B-17 Flying Fortress ultimately carried them all to Australia, and they would land in Alice Springs. Upon arrival to Adelaide by train, he pompously declared a very famous speech, and instead of reading it to you, I thought for once we could actually use a clip on this channel. So let me see if this actually works. I'm going to pull it up here. So this is the actual clip, and yeah, the quality's a bit bad, people, so forgive me, especially with the audio, but here is his little speech in Australia. All right, well, I'll just cut that commercial off. Kind of cuts off at the end, but you get the gist of it. Let me bring back up my map. one thing I'll hand it to MacArthur. Absolutely amazing at spinning a story and doing press tours. He probably would have done well politically if he had actually really made a good run of it for the Republican Party. Maybe he could have challenged Mr. Roosevelt. Who knows? So he
So
makes the speech.
probably could have been what George McClellan was not in terms of political ambition.
Pretty much. So
So he
he
couldn't
does.
resist.
Yeah, he makes that press tour, and he does some interview questions later. For example, he went on to say, "The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines for the purpose, as I understand it, of organizing the American offensive against Japan, a primary object of which is the relief of the Philippines." So MacArthur went in front of the press tour and just bullshitted them and said that the United States government was seeking to liberate the Philippines, which was not the stance of the White House nor the American military for that matter. And this would cause, as most people who know the Pacific War, this whole divide where there's this MacArthur way and then there's, you could call it the Nimitz way of winning the war. And MacArthur,
It's just
oh yeah,
it's just a miracle. At least he had one. He got along with two Navy admirals, I guess, in Thomas Kinkaid
yeah,
and Halsey.
of course,
Though
it's a
I think
miracle.
with Halsey, it kind of tapered off to the end, right?
Yes, of course.
Especially
Well, because
after
they both became
Late
so
Cup.
powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, true.
MacArthur, he assumed he would be in charge of the relief of the Philippines, and he assumed that that would be the primary objective of, the path to defeating Japan, which he's just kind of in his own world there. He would also spend the remainder of the war fighting a two-front battle that Gaurav has alluded to. One was, of course, against the Japanese, and the other one was against the U.S. Navy, uh, who he referred to as the Navy Cabal. And he would arguably fight the U.S. Navy with more fervor than against the Japanese.
Yeah, at least not as intensely as the battle between the IJA and IJN.
Yeah, you can't beat that one. That's a rivalry that's legendary. I have to
Yeah, but I
probably we
think,
should do a standalone episode on that one too. I could do something.
and we can also maybe expand it to Axis because the
Yeah,
Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine did not like each other as well.
of course. Yeah.
Donitz and uh, Goring hated each other, but MacArthur's biggest fear with the Navy was he felt they will take command of America's strategic initiative and maneuvers, and the Army is going to be relegated to a training role, whereas the Marines are going to become the premier infantry arm.
Yeah, I don't, and I mean, as we all know, the Pacific is ground; it's flat land, and there's no need for transportation, amphibious assaults, and such. So, yeah, of course, MacArthur is like, what an. Anyways, I have to
But
stop
everywhere
shitting on
else, it's
MacArthur.
Marines.
Yeah, oh, of
I
course,
mean,
he needs
all
some
Call
Marines.
of Duties, right?
Yeah. So, having devoted enough time to bashing on MacArthur, let's get back into the action. As I mentioned earlier, MacArthur's departure from Corregidor coincided with a significant kind of lull in the fighting because General Homa was reorganizing his forces, giving them rest. Meanwhile, MacArthur's War Plan Orange blunder left General Wainwright's troops in a hopeless predicament. It did not help that some of Bataan's food reserves had been transferred to Corregidor by MacArthur. MacArthur's flight to Australia likely did not
And
bolster
some
morale.
of a very small amount of food.
Yeah. And of course, watching your general just flee the Philippines, that's not going to boost morale for the guys defending Bataan and Corregidor. Although Wainwright's immediate arrival, going to the front lines, did improve relations between the Army and naval personnel, because as you can imagine, MacArthur was blaming the Navy guys for everything left, right, and center. To kind of give the Japanese perspective, when Hideki Tojo read the report on General MacArthur's escape, he was enraged. It seemed this might have been, the final straw for our poor friend General Homa. Tojo instructed his secretary, Colonel Susumu Nishihara, to communicate his concerns about the situation in Bataan. Nishihara presented the issue to Colonel Takushiro Hattori, the chief of operations and his longtime friend. Colonel Hattori had arrived, recently with the 4th Division from Shanghai. After researching the Bataan situation, Hattori concluded that Mount Samat, a rugged hill, actually, let me pull up right over here. So if you can kind of see this middle area and just picture that this is all coalescing into a giant mountain. Yeah. So this entire area in the middle is a very it's deemed not passable in the middle part, but its slopes on the outer parts you can bypass a little bit. As you can see with the red arrows, you can see it's kind of going on the outskirts of it. It is passable on the sides, and yeah, this is going to come up soon. But Mount Samat was a rugged hill rising about nearly 2,000 feet. It's located just behind the center of the defenders' front lines at this point. They deemed it to be a weak point that they should target. Capturing this position would likely lead to the crumbling of the entire defensive line for the Allies. An effective artillery and aerial bombardment in advance would prepare the way for an all-out infantry assault on this vulnerable spot. Encouraged by Nishihara, Hattori convinced General Sugiyama to approve this strategy, which was subsequently presented to General Homa. At first glance, he was deeply satisfied with the proposal, believing that this was, the solution to his ongoing troubles. And to be honest, I'm sure Homa was grasping at straws at this point, pulling out his hair. What little hair he actually had. I think he was kind of bald at that point. But the Imperial Japanese Navy supplied a fresh squadron of Zeros and 24 Betty bombers to Bataan, while the Imperial Japanese Army dispatched 60 Sally bombers. By the end of March, approximately 67,100 Japanese troops, 80 bombers, and 140 artillery pieces were assembled to unleash devastation upon Bataan. And let's consider this. This is literally an area that could, what's the saying, be left to wither on the grapevine, as they used to say in the ancient times. You could just siege them, starve them out. There was no need to actually do any of this, really. They probably should have just sieged this and used these troops for, the other campaigns.
And you could have easily bottled them up with max 20,000 troops. Because 67,000 troops is what? A little over 4 divisions worth. Because if I'm not mistaken, there was
about
the
15.
34,
Yeah, it's about 4.
About 15,000 roughly.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, there was also like the 34th Mixed Independent Brigade that was also operating here.
Mm-hmm.
That can explain why it's 67,000. But yeah, you could have easily dispatched 30 to 40,000 troops to other theaters, especially like the Dutch East Indies, or returned them to the China front.
Yeah, exactly. There's much more critical areas. This is really this entire thing is quite silly, to be honest, from all points of view. It's like it's not just General Homa's fault. Like, yes, he's not doing a great job of taking Bataan, but at the second time, it should be a secondary target.
I think it's Japanese doctrine also to don't want to starve them out. You want to annihilate the enemy.
Yeah. As I won't get into it, this is an issue with the China War. Really, really is. If you look at the Battle of Changsha, for example, where the Chinese will just absolutely tear the Japanese to shreds 4 times in a row. Like, the Japanese lose so much when they could have just let them kind of die on the grapevine, as they say. But anyways, their strategy was to concentrate their primary attack on the Manila Bay side of Bataan, where the 2nd Philippine Corps held the line. And fearing further disgrace, General Homa kind of said this on April the 2nd, there is no reason why this attack should not succeed. So, he's kind of putting his foot down and saying, like, yeah, we got to do this. Before leaving, MacArthur assigned the Visayan force to Brigadier General Bradford Chenoweth. Do you have anything to say about Mr. Chenoweth?
Yeah.
He's a minor character.
He was, true. He predominantly, you could say, was an engineer by profession within the army. Promoted to captain, part of the Mexican punitive edition when he took over. Fortunately, I'm not getting great images that are good quality. And he worked as an engineer for most of the interwar period. Then in October 1939 to 40, he was the commander of the 1st Battalion of the 66th Infantry at Fort George in Maryland and Fort Benning in Georgia. And then as he moved up, right, as a colonel, he commanded the 53rd Regiment. Then in November 1941, he was sent to command the 61st Division at Panay, where he received next month, December 1941, just before war, temporary promotion to Brigadier General. And yeah, he was given the command of the Visayan force in Cebu, and he would, be surrendering his forces later on. Unlike Wainwright, who would be received pretty well later on, it's not much talked about it, but most of the survivors of Bataan were generally received back in good order. But unlike Wainwright, who got promoted up, he just retained his full rank of Brigadier General and retired from the army.
Yep. And I've just put up a little bit of a map up here to explain that the Visayan area here, because as for those who don't know, the Philippines is just a conglomerate of many, many large and small islands. So he is in charge of kind of this group of these islands over here, and it's going to have a lasting impact as there's guerrilla warfare that goes all the way on throughout the entire Pacific War, and he'll be part of that. I'm just going to bring back our map of Bataan again. Like I said, people, I really do implore you to join us on YouTube, as my poor channel, the algorithm is getting destroyed by this podcast. It is hard to pitch regular episodes that are about, 15 to 20 minutes long, and then podcasts that are an hour and a half to 2 hours long. YouTube doesn't like it, and I'm taking a hit for it, but I do believe that this podcast has a great home on YouTube, and I do like to have a visual aspect. But back to the battle at hand. Bradford Chenoweth is now going to allow General Sharp to focus entirely on the defense of Mindanao, from which the Americans still hope to initiate a counteroffensive later. It's kind of a bit of a pipe dream, but, stuff will happen. He also directed Major General George Moore to prepare supplies and fortifications on Corregidor Island for a final stand, should Bataan fall, further exacerbating the food situation for the battling bastards of Bataan. The 1st Corps was then assigned to General Jones, who had commanded the South Luzon force during its retreat to Bataan. He's kind of like the counterpart to Wainwright in many ways. While Major General Edward King, the artillery commander during the campaign, was put in charge of the entire peninsula. By the end of March, improvements had been made to the defenses along the Orion-Bagak line, and the starving, poorly equipped Filipino soldiers had received additional training in jungle warfare. Wainwright's troops took
Not
advantage of
sure
this
how
lull.
effective would it be,
Yeah.
given that they're starving. That's the only
Yeah.
reason I'm just questioning it.
Yeah. Wainwright's troops took advantage of this lull to, excavate their trenches, dig drainage ditches, establish camouflage, clear additional fields of fire, all in preparation for the impending assault. Troops at the front strung barbed wire, constructed tank traps, and other obstacles. In the 1st Corps, engineers planted 3 large minefields along the most likely routes of the enemy advance. It's about 1,400 improvised box mines and 35 submarine depth charges. So, some innovative stuff, despite MacArthur's intentions to maintain command from Australia, which is insane. It's like logistically impossible if you think about it. General Wainwright was ultimately left in charge of the American forces in Luzon, receiving the final order to fight for as long as his troops could hold out. Wainwright was acutely aware that his troops were starving and morale was at rock bottom. General Homa devised a 3-pronged attack along a narrow front surrounding Mount Samat. After overcoming Samat, his forces would then push to Mount Limay and subsequently advance on Merivel. I'm just going to descend my map a little bit down here. As you can see that there is a subsequent little defensive lines, and at the very end is the crucial little port here at Merivel. That's the very last place. I mean, it's over if they get anywhere close to there. But I'm just going to pull back up here.
I mean, then, and not to mention, you have also isolated Corregidor because it's now cut off from Allied forces.
And Homa anticipated this operation would take well over a month to complete, which is wild. But anyways, he dispatched
I can just imagine Tokyo's response to this.
And, it's not his fault that Yamashita, did things way ahead of schedule, but it makes him look it makes it like everybody's making him look bad. So it does suck. And I mean, he is facing, of all the groups, you have the Dutch and the Dutch East Indies, you have the British troops in Malaya. The American troops with their Filipino supporters, they're probably the best frontline forces that are facing the Japanese at this time. Maybe you could argue the guys in Hong Kong, but it's a very small force nonetheless. So, yeah, the Philippines would be one of the hardest campaigns at the very beginning for the Japanese, for sure.
Honestly, if the army chief of staff has taken a dislike to you, unless you are gonna win, with 30,000 troops crushing 300,000, nothing was ever gonna save Homa's career.
Yeah. The only other kind of blunder was, the Wake Island fight, which, they fought like lions against the Japanese, but yeah. So he dispatched the fresh 4th Division, led by Lieutenant General Kitano Kenzo, supported by General Nada's 6th Summer Brigade. It's called the Summer Brigade again because these are kind of, what do we call them? The weekend warrior guys, basically. They're kind of like the guys you send for garrison duty.
National Guard equivalent, I guess.
Yeah, that's the way to think about them. Nara would advance west onto Patagon, up to the Patagon River towards Marivel, where there's a mountain range, while the 4th Division would split into 2 groups. The right wing would traverse the Tawi River and pass through the Katmun Valley towards Samat, and the left wing would head east directly towards Samat. Meanwhile, General Marioka's 16th Division would conduct feint attacks to pin down the First Corps, and the Nagano Detachment would carry out feint maneuvers along the eastern coast. By late March, General Homa unleashed artillery and aerial bombardments up to the defenders' lines, preparing for the assault that was set for April 3rd. At dawn on April 3rd, the Japanese unleashed a 6-hour-long aerial and artillery bombardment over the Mount Samat area. 100 aircraft and 300 artillery pieces from about 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. turned the stronghold of Mount Samat into a, quote, inferno. Over 60,000 tons of bombs rained down upon the defenders, obliterating most of the newly erected defensive structures. So yeah, this was shock and awe. Yeah. The searing heat from the flames forced American and Filipino forces out of their foxholes, compelling them to scramble to secondary lines of defense, only to discover that the whole area was enveloped in fire. I don't know if anyone in the audience has seen some of the movies that have come out recently about the California firefighters. It's actually something along these lines. Like, I've read about it. A lot of the surrounding forestry and the jungle areas were just ablaze, causing massive fires, and people literally suffocated to death because they were just surrounded in flames. It was intense.
And it's quite a jungle terrain in the Bataan Peninsula, so there is that fuel for the fires. And since it's open, right, there's enough oxygen to be sucked in, and that's just creating that firestorm effect.
Hundreds of men would succumb to asphyxiation from the smoke. Some were literally cremated. Panic ensued. It's something like watching animals during a forest fire. Like I said, many would flee, just start fleeing south mindlessly. By the afternoon, the bombardment had smashed open the door, and the ground assault was now coming. Amidst all the smoke and the flames, the Japanese infantry and their tanks advanced unhindered, quickly creating a 3-mile gap. When General George Parker, commanding the 2nd Philippine Corps in the eastern half of Bataan, received reports of the situation, which was at around dusk, he deployed 600 men to attempt, to plug the breach, but it was far too late. The following day, General Nara's forces swept west of Mount Samat, while the fresh 4th Division circled around the other side. The forces under Nara confronted the bulk of the 41st Division, while Kitano's troops encountered the 21st Division, commanded by Brigadier General Mateo Kempimpin. The Japanese had anticipated intense opposition, yet they found none. In reality, the heavy bombardment had decimated the 42nd and the 43rd Regiments, leaving only the 41st Regiment to actually battle them. And they were retreating to a line near the junction of routes 29 and 429 further south. So I just want to pull up the map. I don't know if it has the routes on it. No, probably not. It's not that detailed. But you can imagine, just based off of the lines that you're seeing, if you're watching this on YouTube, kind of the general retreat, just by looking at where the Japanese are going. To the right wing, the 4th Division now crossed the Tara River, and they sent the 21st Regiment fleeing for their lives. By nightfall, both forces had progressed about 1,000 yards with minimal resistance, further diminishing the defenders' morale. The next day brought more artillery and aerial bombardments. The remnants of the 42nd and 43rd Regiments turned and fled in a panic, nearly encircling the 41st during a fighting withdrawal. They fought valiantly, but the bombardments were overwhelmingly intense, forcing their continued retreat south. Meanwhile, the left wing of the 4th Division clashed with the 22nd and 23rd Regiments, driving them into a retreat. Confused by the multitude of moving forces, the defenders' artillery began to just fire indiscriminately, hitting several friendly units attempting to halt the Japanese advances. So we call this like a break in the chain of command, like everything's going to chaos now. By the end of the day, the Japanese had occupied the entire main line of resistance, with the right wing of the 4th Division solidly seizing the foothills of Samat. General King ordered the 31st Regiment to reinforce the lines. So on a sweltering Easter Sunday, that being April the 5th, American and Filipino troops entrenched on parts of Mount Samat were subjected to relentless shelling. Once the bombardment had subsided, Japanese infantry surged up the mountain, and after lunch, they hoisted the Rising Sun flag upon its peak. As Colonel Hattori had predicted, the capture of the mountain sent shockwaves throughout the entire Bataan defense system. In a desperate response, General Parker ordered a 4-pronged counterattack to try and regain the main defensive line. Simultaneously, General Homa launched an attack southeast towards the Lamai River. The two forces collided, leading to the encirclement and the destruction of half of General Parker's 31st Division. There was nothing to prevent Nara's forces from sweeping to the end of the peninsula now. Now, to the east of Mount Samat, the lines were still holding. Brigadier General Clifford Blumel attempted to rally the battered 31st Division for a counterattack, but was quickly forced to retreat. Acting without orders, he began forming a new defensive line along the small San Vicente River. From the heights of Mount Samat, Colonel Hattori observed the unfolding of his war plans better than he could have ever imagined. Now, over to the west, he could see Nada's troops were flowing relentlessly past the scouted and routed American units. To the east, the 4th Division began pressing against Brigadier General Blumel's improvised defensive line. By nightfall, this line was all that stood between General Holmes' forces and a complete rout of the Bataan defenses. Just coming back over here to the map, you can see the names of the rivers here, and you can see where that line was kind of formed. Now, Blumel conducted an inspection tour during the day when he spotted a truck column emerging towards his rear flank. The San Vicente line has broken, screamed a GI from the first vehicle. Blumel knew he could not hope to halt the stampede of Allied troops now fleeing for their lives. Allegedly, he physically tried to grab some men, shouting at them to stand and fight, but they broke free and they simply ran. Excuse me. Now, Major General King, who we've kind of talked about here, by any chance, do you have any notes on King?
One of the most interesting things is he was an officer that got commissioned into the United States Army well before World War One even broke out. His parents actually wanted him to be a lawyer, but he definitely said like, yeah, I need a more adventurous life, and so he served with distinction, right? Commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1908. This guy is much more experienced in comparison to many of the other generals. He had pretty much staff job in the interwar period, and he was an instructor at both the Army and Navy War colleges, and he was sent in 1940, where he got promoted to brigadier general and was by rank the second highest military officer under MacArthur after Jonathan Wainwright. And as we discussed, right, MacArthur moves to Australia, Wainwright takes over, he gets command of the Luzon force area. And he had served here in the Philippines with the 2nd Artillery in 1915 to 17, so he has some familiarity with the area. But I think he is going to be the person that, for better or worse, whichever way you want to view it, was the reason the American surrender took place on the 9th of April. Because I think he had enough. He don't want to push his men even more, given the horrible lack of food and medication that they'd been suffering with, or lack of, for months.
Yeah.
And this would lead to the first major surrender of United States forces in the war.
So Major General King had just taken command of the Luzon force after Wainwright received the prestigious promotion as the man to bear the brunt of Douglas MacArthur's failures, as I would put it. King was a modest man, like you said, courteous to the ranks of his men amongst them, an intellectual and an experienced artilleryman. On April the 7th, shortly after Blumel's line had crumbled, he received a phone call from Corregidor. Wainwright asked him why, since the troops on the western half of the peninsula were intact, they shouldn't just turn right and attack towards Manila Bay, splitting Homa's line in two. King thought about it while acknowledging that although half of their line still held some positions, they were in no physical condition to launch such an assault. Nevertheless, he reluctantly agreed to give the attack a chance. The recently promoted Major General Albert Jones, commanding the 1st Philippine Corps, was not so enthusiastic about this. Jones deemed the attack senseless, and he communicated this directly to Wainwright through a 3-way phone line connecting him with King as well. Wainwright left the decision to King, and he hung up. King ordered Jones to withdraw his troops in 4 phases. Additionally, he sent his chief of staff, Brigadier General Arnold Funk, to Corregidor to persuade Wainwright that the troops would likely surrender at any moment. That's how bad the situation has become. Just a moment. Garev, I think, got kicked out of the call, and I am just letting him come back in. I can carry on with the script, though. Wainwright faced pressure from commanders in Bataan, including Funk, who stated that surrender was imminent, coupled with MacArthur's radio messages alerting him that he was utterly opposed to under any circumstances or conditions, to the ultimate capitulation of this command. That he should prepare and execute an attack upon the enemy once food supplies were exhausted. But to this, what could Wainwright actually do? He instructed Funk, "You will go and tell General King he will not surrender. Tell him he will attack. Those are my orders." The response he received was, "General, you know, of course, what the situation is like over there. You know that the outcome, what it will be, To this, Wainwright said, I do, I understand. The following afternoon,
It's just, I think he just wants to stay compliant to orders, even though I think if Wainwright had a choice without official supreme orders, he probably would have
yeah,
surrendered by now.
yeah, he would have, yeah. The following afternoon, Colonel Takeo Imai planted the Rising Sun flag atop Mount Yamai as Japanese infantrymen poured steadily down the eastern half of Bataan. So I'm just going to take the picture, my little map. I'm just going to go a little bit further down here because we're going south now. Fleeing before the advancing Japanese columns were American and Filipino troops pouring into the jungles near the tip of the peninsula. It seemed that terror alone propelled the exhausted men forward. At the end of the peninsula in the town of Marivel, a few boats were evacuating the last refugees to Corregidor, while other vessels were being scuttled in the bay. Most of the mobs of disorganized soldiers watched with resentment as the privileged few were being evacuated at the docks. So here, actually, that's a better look at the map where Marivel is. So men are now departing. On April the 8th, the 57th Infantry Regiment and the 31st Division were completely overrun at the Alagan River. The 45th Infantry, ordered to reach Corregidor, failed to reach their embarkation point before being cut off and encircled. Eventually, only 300 men from the 31st Infantry managed to cross over to the island. In total, approximately 2,100 men had made their way to Corregidor, with about half of them being sailors and Marines. As for the Filipino Army, Major General King, Wainwright's field commander, on Bataan reported, "In 2 days, an army vanished into thin air." And yeah, from another quote from a soldier who was in Miraval at the time, he had this to say: "They were going to join those draft dodgers on Corregidor, where life was soft with plenty of drinking water, canned food, and romantic nurses. They would sit safely in the Malinta Tunnel until the mile-long convoy arrived to relieve them. They would be the heroes, while those left to rot on Bataan would be disgraced for throwing in the towel."
I mean,
So,
I can completely relate to why he would be saying that.
yeah, pretty pissed off, and it seems like he actually believes there's a relief column coming to the Philippines, which is, not going to happen. Psst. Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself? Uh-oh, you live in Japan, and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, Season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it. Without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software, and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War Channel And a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. At his HQ in the Malinta Tunnel, Wainwright phoned King at about 11:30 p.m. on the 8th, and he ordered him to launch a northward attack using Jones's 1st Philippine Corps. King passed the order to Jones, who replied, "Any attack is ridiculous. It's out of the question." King told him to dismiss the idea of the attack, and he instructed his chief of staff and the operations officer to meet him at midnight. There was no debate. The situation was completely hopeless. Wainwright was hamstrung by MacArthur's explicit order to attack until the end, leading King to shoulder the dreadful burden himself. He understood that by doing so, he risked court-martial if he ever returned to the United States, but he believed the lives of over 78,000 soldiers were more important than his honor at this point. King informed the men, "I have decided to surrender Bataan. I have not communicated with General Wainwright because I do not want him to assume any part of the responsibility." I think it's very courageous what King did. And
It is because a lot. If you just go through military history, right, so many of these commanders are just so hell bent on honor, glory, and he's still also trying to protect his superior officer as well from an impossible situation.
Absolutely, because he
Really
understands
commendable
the
what he-
situation. Yeah.
Yeah,
Just before 2 a.m. the next morning, Jones called King. However, neither could really say a word. There was just deafening roar in the background of the artillery. The roof of King's command post actually exploded during the call, showering rubble down. And he was heard to say, "For crying out loud, Ned, what's going on? The ammunition dump is blowing up. Hell, I can feel the ground shaking all the way up here. It must be an earthquake. I hate to tell you this, but I'm surrendering at 6 a.m. Put up the white flags all along your lines and destroy the artillery and ammunition for your machine guns. I don't see what else you can do." 4 hours later, a duty officer in the Malinta Tunnel informed Wainwright of King's decision to surrender. Apparently, Wainwright said, "Tell them not to do it. They can't do it." It took some time for Wainwright to calm down, and then he radioed MacArthur. He had this to say: "At 6 o'clock this morning, General King, without my knowledge or approval, sent a flag of truce to the Japanese commander. The moment I heard of it, I disapproved of his action, and I directed that there would be no surrender. I was informed too late to make any changes, that the action has already been taken." So at 9 a.m., King, wearing his last clean uniform, he drove up to the front in a Jeep with 2 aides. Japanese guides escorted them to the experimental farm station at Namao. At that moment, King reflected that General Lee had surrendered to Grant on that same day, April 9th. Lee remarked just before the ceremony, "Then there is nothing left to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." And a black Cadillac arrived with, Colonel Moto Nakayama, who through an interpreter asked King if he was General Wainwright. He said, "No, I am General King, commander of all the forces on Bataan." This puzzled Nakayama, who requested King to go fetch Wainwright, explaining that the Japanese could not accept the surrender without him. "My forces are no longer fighting units. I want to stop further bloodshed." This is what he said to him. "Surrender must be unconditional." He asked, "Will our troops be well treated?" The Japanese interpreter said, "We are not barbarians. Will you surrender unconditionally?"
sorry.
King nodded, explaining to Nakayama that he had left his saber in Manila and instead placed his pistol on the table. American and Filipino soldiers huddled together. Many wept in humiliation, while others wept in relief that it was finally over. And they anxiously awaited the arrival of the conquerors. Air Corps Captain Mark Woodfeld observed some of the first Japanese troops packing a large mountain gun, who approached with smiles and spoke amiably. To Woodfeld, they did not seem as bad as he expected. However, the Japanese soldiers began stripping the prisoners of blankets, watches, jewelry, equipment, food, and even their toothbrushes. A Japanese soldier discovered 25 rounds of .45 caliber pistol ammunition on Woodfeld, shouting at him and then beating him with the butt of his rifle. Someone beside Woodfeld muttered, "For Christ's sake, don't fall down." Another Japanese soldier saw a gold ring on Lieutenant Colonel Jack Sewell and attempted to yank it off. "It's my wedding ring," Sewell had protested, pulling his hand back. The Japanese soldier snapped the bayonet of his rifle and approached Sewell, when Woodfeld interposed himself. And allegedly, Sewell and Woodfeld lacked the strength to remove the ring, so Woodfeld smeared blood from his own head wound onto the finger to dislodge the ring. As more Japanese began to rob the men of their belongings, one Japanese officer, noticed a soldier attempting to take a ring Featuring the University of Notre Dame's insignia on it, the officer hit the Japanese soldier in the face and then returned the ring to the American, remarking in plain English, "When did you graduate?" The man said 1935. The Japanese soldier said, "I graduated from Southern California in 35. So, it's just one of those small stories of not every one of them was being asshole.
I know. It's kind of like, both ways from both sides of the war. Even American troops were also known to plunder the
Of course,
corpses.
it's war. Yeah.
And at the same time, not every person who worked for the Third Reich's forces, willingly committed the same atrocities that they're known for. So it's just that, they're just people. They're the same, cut from the same cloth, ultimately, in a way. So just want to, I'm actually glad you highlighted this out, because it just puts that aspect into war that maybe people tend to forget.
Yeah, the for those who don't know, obviously for a lot of these podcasts, it's not fully scripted, but I'm using notes from previous work. This was from the Pacific War Week by Week series. I can't remember the source I used for the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. I think this one was from Frank Costello, his book on the Pacific War, if I'm not mistaken, but could have been also from Ian Toll's trilogy, The Pacific Crucible. It might have been from that book. Regardless, Wainwright then received a message from President Roosevelt, and it stated this: "I am keenly aware of the tremendous difficulties under which you are waging your great battle. The physical exhaustion of your troops obviously precludes the possibility of a major counterattack, unless our efforts to rush food to you should quickly prove successful. Because of the state over which your forces have no control, I am modifying my orders to you. My purpose is to leave you to your best judgment any decisions affecting the future of the Bataan garrison. I feel it proper and necessary that you should be assured of complete freedom of action, and of my full confidence in the wisdom of whatever decision you may be forced to make."
I think it's actually pretty nice of Roosevelt, because he's kind of giving him that supreme command order that, you get freedom of action. Because, for example, this is exactly what Paulus grappled with Hitler's orders at Stalingrad.
Yeah. Paulus, Hitler's number one most loyal man. But over in Australia, MacArthur read a prepared statement to reporters and stated this: "The Bataan force went out as it would have wished, fighting to the end its flickering, forlorn hope. No army has done so much with so little, and nothing became it more than its last hours of trial and agony. To the weeping mothers of its dead, I can only say that the sacrifices and halo of Jesus of Nazareth has descended upon their sons, and that God's will take them upon himself." So yeah, taking a moment to reflect on that quote again, as MacArthur said, no army has done so much with so little, and nothing became it more than that. Last hours of trial and agony.
It almost feels a bit like, Church, like a bit from Churchill's speech about the Battle of Britain.
MacArthur
feels a bit on that.
Many people describe MacArthur as being Shakespearean because he actually had a thing for theater and writing. So yeah, he was very good at writing these pieces. So yeah, you have to think about it. MacArthur is actually a large reason why, it's like his last disastrous orders is what's causing a lot of this hardship in the end. It's a little gross that he's making these grand speeches, but whatever. The situation was not over, of course. Over in Corregidor, 13,000 troops were stationed. Its defenses were considered impregnable. However, a lack of water and food meant the defenders were on their last legs. Intense artillery and aerial bombardment were degrading their morale. Submarines that once delivered food, mail, and war supplies could no longer do so. The garrison was doomed by dwindling supplies, and it could no longer, hold on much longer, for that matter. When Homa began planning for the final end of Bataan, he estimated he would be capturing around 25,000 prisoners. He delegated the logistical planning to his transportation officer, Major General Yoshikata Kawane. Kawane divided the operation into 2 phases, and then 10 days before the final assault, he presented the plan to General Homa for approval. Colonel Toshimitsu Takatsu would oversee the first phase, transporting all the prisoners to Balanga, which lay about halfway up the peninsula. And at this point, I'm going to be putting up a new map, and right over here. Let me just zoom in a little bit. Yeah, there we go. So, to Balanga. It lays about halfway up the peninsula. The distance from Marivel at the southern tip of Bataan was approximately 19 miles, a simple march for the well-fed Japanese soldiers, which there's no need for transportation or additional food supplies, as the American and Filipinos could rely on their own rations. This is what the Japanese expected when they were planning this. But because of the blundering of War Plan Orange, which continues to rear its ugly head in the series, Kawane would personally have to supervise the second phase, which was the journey from Balanga to the prison camp. No more than 200 trucks could be allocated for this operation, but this was deemed sufficient to shuttle prisoners about 33 miles from Balanga to the railway center at San Fernando. From there, freight trains would transport the men north an additional 30 miles to Capas, a village directly north of Clark Field. They would then trek another 8 miles to their new home, which was known as Camp O'Donnell. Kawane assured Homa that the Allied prisoners would receive the same rations as Japanese troops, and that the field hospitals would be set up at Balanga and San Fernando, along with other multiple medical units and aid stations and resting places every few miles to help the men out. But
This sounds so nice.
Yeah, it's a well thought and genuinely nice plan. Homa approved it, of course. Looking at it, this is what was sold to him. But there was a major problem.
And let's also just admit that Homa was actually pretty nice for a Japanese commander.
Yes, he was known as the drama general because he liked theater and stuff.
I thought it was poet.
The poet general.
Poetic general, yeah.
He was another man who was educated outside of Japan. He got to see the West. He was a softie, as I said in one of the episodes. I like to compare him with General Yamashita, who had a good understanding of Europe for that matter. And there's of course other famous Japanese generals who go to the West. Kobayashi, yeah. They seem to be more empathetic to the plight of men and stuff. And yeah, he's one of them. And that's why his superiors and his colleagues hate him, actually. So like I said, this is a great plan. Absolutely, the Japanese did not have a nefarious, overt or covert plan to do harm to the Americans, but they were planning for 25,000 prisoners. There was 75,000 starving men suffering from malaria who had no rations. The Japanese did not account for this. So at Merivale's, groups of about 300 prisoners began walking up the road. Some had no guards, while others were escorted by, as many as 4. The prisoners passed King's former HQ, where a side road led to a military hospital. A rumor began to circulate that within the hospital, the Japanese were liberating all the Filipinos. The chief of surgery rushed from ward to ward, shouting to the Filipinos that it was nothing more than a hoax, however. The Japanese guards, eager to rid themselves of responsibilities, encouraged patients to join the lines of prisoners marching along. Caught up in the mass hysteria, about 5,000 men scrambled out, onto the dusty trail, including amputees, individuals on crutches, and those with open wounds. The ditches along the roads brimmed with their dead as they marched. Meanwhile, the men marching from Merivales continued up the coast to Bataan. As the prisoners moved northward, heavy Japanese equipment streamed south in preparations for the assault on Corregidor. Japanese infantrymen taunted the prisoners, knocking off their hats and helmets with long bamboo poles. Occasionally, a Japanese soldier would actually intervene to stop the behavior and apologize to the captives. At one point, a Japanese officer rushed up to an American tank commander and embraced him because they had been classmates at UCLA. So again, there are Japanese
alma mater.
Mm-hmm. There you go. However, there was no consistency in the Japanese soldiers' actions. A truckload of troops might toss down canteens to help the prisoners, while another would, take liberated golf clubs that they'd stolen somewhere and beat them over the heads with them. The brutalities of the first day were spontaneous, but they would soon change. Notorious Colonel Masanobu Tsuichi arrived in Manila several days earlier from Singapore.
Suji.
Yeah. Where, he had just come back from Singapore, where he had orchestrated the Sukching massacre that was about 5,000 Chinese had been murdered in. We were talking about this in another episode. Allegedly, without Homa's knowledge, probably without Homa's knowledge given Soichi and how he did things, he persuaded several admirers amongst the general staff that this was a racial war and that all the prisoners in the Philippines should be simply executed. The Americans for being nothing more than white colonists and the Filipinos for betraying their fellow Asian race. This prompted division amongst the officers, and one of them contacted Colonel Lemay, who had just conquered Mount Lemay, and instructed him with this order: kill all prisoners and those offering to surrender. Imai responded, how can I possibly obey such an order? I want this order in writing. The divisional officer merely explained that the order came from Imperial HQ and that he would have to comply. Imai refused to act without a written order, and he hung up the phone. Instead, Imai commanded his staff to free all the prisoners, providing directions as the best way that they could escape from Bataan. His staff stared at him in disbelief as he gave the order, prompting him to yell at them to obey his command. And then he said, stop standing around like some wooden-headed dolls. More than 1,000 prisoners would be released. As the former prisoners fled into the jungle, Imai mused that no Japanese general would have ever issued such an inhumane order. But if it was true, he would pretend that the prisoners had just escaped on their own. It seems to me that Officer Imai kind of knew more of what was going on amongst the ranks, and he probably heard some rumors about things.
Maybe those thousands still died, over the course of the war, but on his actions, he did what was proper because he's literally like, give me a written order. I don't give a damn if it's coming from the Imperial General Staff.
Yeah. Which doesn't make any sense, by the way, if you're in the chain of command. But for those who don't know, Tsuji famously did this earlier in the Malayan campaign. And the way that he went about this is, instead of talking directly to his superior officer, which was Yamashita, he was just, what would you say? He was doing orders over radio to officers at the front lines, and he was just independently telling them, hey, execute your prisoners, or do this, do that. And he would just say, oh, but it's Yamashita who's telling me to tell you this. And he would just informally keep doing this to cause more and more massacres. So, yeah.
I think it was also him, right, trying to discredit men who his boss Tojo hated.
Yeah, he was, not that he was a spy, but he was directly working covertly for Hideki Tojo to basically hinder generals in the army who Hideki Tojo saw as primary rivals. So the most apparent one is Yamashita. Yamashita, if it wasn't for, this goes way into history, I shouldn't talk about it, but there was a coup attempt in 1936 that besmirched Yamashita and like almost ended his career. If it wasn't for that, Yamashita might have ended up overthrowing Hideki Tojo and being the leader of the army. But Hideki Tojo always hated Yamashita. They were on two different cliques. Hideki Tojo was the leader of the Tosaha. Yamashita was a prominent member of the Kodaha faction. They hated each. I don't even think Yamashita hated him or anything, but anyways, Yamashita was treated as a rival. And Homa, likewise, was seen as another guy who was a rival to him. So he had Masanobu Tsuji kind of screwing these guys over in the background. Tsuji would order and oversee the execution of about 400 Filipino officers and NCOs near the Patican River. Most of these men were shot, bayoneted, or beheaded with katanas. And this incident became known as the Patigan River Massacre. A similar order to kill prisoners was verbally transmitted to Major General Tora Ikuta, a commander of the recently arrived garrison unit. Like Imai, Ikuta and his chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Nobuhiko Jimbo, were skeptical that the order originated from the Imperial HQ. The staff officer delivering the order informed Ikuta that his own division was already executing prisoners, and he urged him to do the same. The general refused to act without a written order. Again,
it's actually crazy. Like, why would Imperial HQ even issue such orders? Because they literally have a myriad more problems. Like,
of course, yeah.
Directing the war against China, the Dutch East Indies, securing the Emperor's favor, fighting the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Yeah. And none of these orders should be, like, it doesn't make any sense in the chain of command of things. If you would have said, oh, this is coming from General Homa, it would have made more sense. But the thing is, if Tsuji said, hey, this is coming from General Homa, some of these guys might actually radio in and ask Homa themselves. So that's why he was trying to be clever with this ploy. That night, the marchers from Medivales endured severe conditions. They were crammed together in enclosures that made it difficult to move. Captain Mark Woodfeld, the guy we were talking about, had drifted off to sleep when a foul stench roused him. Upon opening his eyes, he found his face lying on filthy rags. He jumped up under the bright tropical moonlight, realized the rags were actually the trousers of a man behind him soaked in excrement and blood. He said, "That rotten son of a bitch." Well, this is what he shouted. He shoved the trousers into the soldier's face, but the man did not even move. Woodfeld called out for him to get up. And he pulled his face only to discover that the man was dead. So the man had just literally died beside him. And as we know, your bowels open up when you die. So the Japanese guards were, angered by all this commotion. They began hitting Wolfeld, this poor guy, tossing him around. And then he was pointing out, the dead American soldier. He demanded permission to remove the corpse, but neither guard offered any assistance as he struggled to do so. He felt terrible for degrading the dead man, thinking it was all some kind of sick joke. He went on to write that he thought the Japanese had actually put that guy beside him on purpose. General Kaone had projected that it would take about a day for the prisoners to march to Balanga. However, many were on the road for over 3 days, because of course there's so many wounded. With every mile, the guards grew increasingly irritated and more brutal. The sun blazed relentlessly, providing little shade for the marchers. And by April the 11th, Balanga was bustling with shouting guards, herding waves upon waves of prisoners. It quickly became evident that the logistics were completely strained. An attempt was made to provide the prisoners their first meal, but the overwhelming numbers led frustration and, just disastrous distribution. Some received rice, salt, and water, while others got nothing at all. From Balanga, Kaone intended to transport all the prisoners in trucks to San Fernando, yet more than half would have to continue on foot. General Jones led his column through the night, covering over 8 miles to reach Onai. There they were crammed into a rice paddy enclosed by barbed wire. With the onset of darkness came another nightmare. Swarms upon swarms of mosquitoes was descending upon them. For those needing to relieve themselves, they were taken to latrine pits, which consisted of open holes filled with feces, requiring one man to assist another, or they risked falling in and drowning. Pretty gross. In the morning, Mark Wilfeld noticed a few dead bodies were floating in some of these pits. Wilfeld attempted to persuade the Japanese guards to let him and others retrieve the bodies, only to be thrown to the ground and beaten for his efforts. So this Wilfeld guy he had a hard time during what is known as the Bataan Death March. The next day, prisoners were fed lugao, a paste-like rice mush. The trek to the next station, which was at Lubao, was another 60 miles. Another place where guards were inhumane. It was another place where some of the guards were more humane. They permitted water breaks, but others, were kicking the cans of water over, set by Filipino civilians, and they were forcing the prisoners to squat in the scorching sun as a rest break. So again, evil's being done, acts of goodness are being done. It's all over the place.
I think I remember we had this, conversation between the two of us on why the Japanese also were quite, aggressive as well. I think one of the reasons
I just released the episode. I have an episode on my Patreon literally titled "Why Was the Japanese Military? Why They Performed So Many Atrocities?" And it's going to be released on the Pacific War Week by Week podcast for free next week. So that would be, the week of September the 20th.
I mean, yeah. I think it is just down to supplies and their own officers beating the crap out of them. So this is the easiest way to take it out.
Yeah, I had a history professor describe it as a large pecking order. It was a system of physical abuse, and every Japanese from general to grunt was beaten the shit out of. And when you went all the way down the pecking order and there was no one under you, the grunts would start beating up civilians.
You take it out on the POWs and civilians.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, as you mentioned in one example here, right, the officer who was trying not to have his the Notre Dame ring removed, that Japanese officer who graduated from Southern California, he literally beat up the Japanese soldier who was taking the ring away from the American. Yep. So I think that's just an example of an officer beating up the soldier.
It was systemic, the violence against their troops, like physically, the beatings. There's also a culture of not respecting an adversary that surrendered. They saw it as, disgusting. So they had cultural things that kind of like enforce the idea that these people should not be treated well. In the episode, if people are interested, in a week or two, it'll come out on the Pacific War Week by Week podcast. I have basically 10 categories I go through as to why the Japanese did what they did. So you can listen to it there. It tries to explain it in a very thorough manner because it's a very complex situation. It has to deal with a very bastardized version of Bushido, a culture that promotes suicide and not surrender for that matter, and violence amongst the troops against each other. There's a lot of factors. So, yeah. Corpses lined the ditches along the sides.
Funny that they try to take inspiration from the Shogun era, segregated
Yeah, I
eye
know.
kind of. But a lot of those guys were willing to actually surrender for the safety of their men, as long as they just committed seppuku and such. So it was really like the top command that would get gutted. Now it's just everyone gets gutted.
Yeah, exactly. So corpses lined the ditches along the sides of the roads, with crows tearing into them amidst clouds of flies. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Stowell began counting the corpses, reaching 27 before he chided to himself, "You've got to cut this out." And then he resumed marching with his gaze fixed straight ahead. A young Filipino, Lieutenant Tony Aquino, who had actually swum to Corregidor to see President Quezon, had been walking without rest or water, and he had lost about 50 pounds since arriving in Bataan. His legs were swollen, and when an American crumpled before him, a Japanese guard began to kick the man until he struggled painfully to rise, extending his hand in a plea for help. The Japanese officer stabbed him with his bayonet right through the man's neck, then pushed his body right into a ditch, as Aquino watched helplessly. Further back, General Blumel marched alongside Brigadier General Luther Stevens when a Japanese soldier in a passing truck swung a bamboo pole viciously at Stevens' head. Blumel caught his staggering colleague as the two fell towards a ditch. A guard pointed a revolver at Blumel, motioning for him to march on, but Blumel ignored the order, helping a dazed Stevens to his feet. Yet Stevens' legs buckled, and he fell into the middle of a rice paddy. Another guard then rushed at them with a fixed bayonet, assuming that they were trying to flee. But when he saw Stevens face down the rice paddy, he presumed he was dead, and he gestured for Blumel to continue. Stevens then crawled behind some underbrush, and he watched as the column moved onwards. So had it not been for Blumel's bravery, he would have been killed. Unfortunately, another Japanese unit would later discover him and take him back as a prisoner, so he did not escape. At a rest stop a few miles north, Corporal Roy Castleberry witnessed two civilians digging a hole and placing a delirious American captain into it. When the captain realized what was happening, he desperately struggled to try and escape what was being his grave, prompting a guard to order the Filipinos to hit the man over the head with their shovels. They initially refused until the Japanese raised his rifles at them. With contorted faces in anguish, they struck the captain over the head with their shovels, and they buried him alive. Castleberry saw a hand feebly clawing out of the dirt of that grave. And that image apparently haunted him for the rest of his life.
Can't
Yeah.
blame him, man. It's
rough.
ghastly.
Many prisoners who fell were just shot or bayoneted. Some Japanese officers on horseback beheaded prisoners with their katanas. As prisoners made their way to Lubao, they encountered a particularly brutal stretch of unshaded road. Thirst became unbearable, and many prisoners risked their lives trying to sneak into sugarcane fields to get, a drop of moisture. Most men were so dehydrated they could no longer urinate, and those who could reported it was like pissing hot iron. At Lubao, a city of about 30,000 residents at the time, people lined the streets trying to toss food like hard-boiled eggs, fried chicken wrapped in banana leaves, and pieces of panachao to the men, alongside hard brown sugar, and the Japanese guards held the crowds of civilians back with their rifles. But occasionally an elderly Filipino woman would grab a prisoner, pull him out of the column, standing over him with her long skirt to try and protect them. At the far edge of the town, the Japanese began herding the front line of prisoners into large tin-roofed rice mills, packing several thousand men inside. There was only a single water spigot, and any minor act of insubordination could result in the prisoners being slashed with sabers or bayonets. Some were beaten to death without any reason at all given to it. The final stretch to San Fernando was about 9 miles, and it was brutal. The asphalt roads, churned by tanks and trucks, felt like molten lava under the sun.
I'm sorry, as if the rest of the march wasn't brutal by any standard.
Yeah. A lot of these guys are barefoot, by the way, so you can only imagine the soles of their feet are just in agony. As the starving, dehydrated men passed lines of trucks, it felt like a gauntlet, with soldiers in the vehicles swinging the rifle butts and bamboo poles to hit the Filipinos and the Americans. In town, civilians came from all over Luzon in search of their loved ones, weeping when they saw the skeletal army that was marching. And here, at least some of the aspects of Kwane's plan were executed with a semblance of efficiency. The prisoners received rice balls, water, and medical treatment here. They were confined in makeshift locations like dance halls, poetry sheds, empty lots, schools, and old factories and such. Lieutenant Aquino's group was locked inside of a rundown vinegar factory, where he collapsed unconscious for over 14 hours. Upon waking, he was escorted by some Japanese to Japanese barracks, where his father was with a Japanese colonel. His father embraced him. Mr. Aquino is a good friend of Japan, said a Kempeitai commander with a British accent, before telling Aquino that he could go home. However, Aquino refused to abandon his men, and he instead requested more food and medicine for the prisoners. Your father was right. He said you would refuse. Please accept my apologies for the treatment that you have all endured, was what the Kempeitai officer said. Aquino was allowed to spend some time with his father, who informed him that President Quezon was trying to secure earlier releases for the Filipinos being sent to the prison camps. He said, "Hurry, Papa, we're dying like flies." The men were then crammed into boxcars with over 100 or so per car. Soon the vehicles were filled with vomit, feces, and urine. The stench became unbearable, according to Staff Sergeant Alf Larson. The train consisted of 6 or 7 World War I era boxcars. They packed us in the cars like sardines. So tight you couldn't sit down. Then they shut the door. If you passed out, they couldn't fall down. If someone had to go to the toilet, you went right there where you were. It was close to summer, and the weather had hot and humid temperatures, hotter than Billy Blazes. We were on the train from early in the morning to late in the afternoon without getting out. People died in the railroad cars. From there was a 3-hour trip to Capas, and many men would perish along the way. Some guards opened the locked doors, while others just kept them closed, preventing fresh air from entering. Filipinos frequently approached, handing over water bottles, tomatoes, bananas, rice, and other items. Many Americans who had previously held racial biases towards Filipinos began to really appreciate their courage and humanity. At Capas,
It's actually just really call that out, the courage of the civilian population for even attempting this. Even at the town of, Lubao, where, like they'll try to get a prisoner, right, under that old woman's long skirt, because if they are caught, their family is history.
yeah, because they're going to be occupied, and it's a brutal occupation, to be sure. At Capas, the trains were unloaded, and the prisoners faced an additional 8-mile trek by foot over sun-baked and dusty roads to Camp O'Donnell. Upon arrival, they were herded through, the gates, flanked by towers manned by machine gun nests. They were forced to sit for hours under the sun before an officer, the camp commander, strode out. He faced them, and he announced in a belligerent tone, through an interpreter, that the U.S. was his greatest enemy, and that the Japanese would defeat the Americans even if it took 100 years. 2 days after the first group arrived at Camp O'Donnell, the Manila Sunday Tribunal published a picture of the march, accompanied by a Japanese-inspired narrative, and here's an excerpt from it. The task of observing the tragic aspect of marching war prisoners from the Bataan front, where they surrendered on April the 9th to San Fernando, Papagan, prior to the entertainment to their permanent concentration camp. It is a sad one, hence our effort to avoid details about the entire episode. To avoid giving the public the wrong impression from such an anatic remark, we clarify that the Imperial Japanese forces, whose mission is to clearly prosecute the current war to its successful conclusion, are going well out of their way to feed and assist 50,000 men who were once their enemies beyond any reasonable expectations. If, in spite of the humane treatment the Japanese are providing to these prisoners, they are too weak to reach their destinations, we can only blame the high command of the American forces for surrendering when many of their men had already been grievously weakened due to the lack of food and diseases. So yeah, the Japanese are actually kind of showcasing that even they are a little bit embarrassed by how bad this is going. General Homa would, yeah.
I guess there is just also they're using some experts, the planning details, right? Because the original plan was very human and considerate.
Yeah, of course. Meanwhile, General Homa, he was, he's too preoccupied with what would become a 2-month campaign against Corregidor. And he was only about to learn about the fate of the prisoners, later on. A total of 54,000 prisoners actually reached Camp O'Donnell, with quite a few escaping, making it difficult to determine the exact death toll. Estimates indicate that between 7,000 and 10,000 died during the march due to starvation, dehydration, malaria, beatings, and executions, including around 2,330 Americans. So if you heard that right, a lot of Filipinos were killed. Most survivors declared the march to have been a cruel plan orchestrated by the Japanese high command. The cruelty was not systemic. It was fortunate, more because they didn't allocate enough for 75,000 people. Some fortunate prisoners rode trucks from Balanga to San Fernando and experienced minimal suffering, for example, while others marched and encountered brutality, or no brutality at all. It was pretty random. However, countless others were, murdered, beaten, or starved in an unsystematic manner. Brutality amongst the Japanese soldiers at this time was, a way of life. They endured beatings from their officers, who themselves suffered beatings from their superiors and so forth, as I was mentioning to Gareth before, the pecking order. And for the Japanese soldier, surrender was simply not an option. It was the ultimate disgrace. Their manuals advised, bear in mind the fact that to be captured means not only disgrace to the army, but your parents and family will never be able to hold their heads high again. Always save the last round for yourself. This is literally written in their manual. Many Japanese soldiers had witnessed the enemy firing their last rounds at their colleagues before surrendering. So that contributes to the behavior I say a little bit. There's also this account from the Japan Times and Advertiser, written on April the 24th. They, the Allies, surrender after sacrificing all the lives that they can, except their own, for a cause which they know is futile. They surrender merely to save their own skins. They have shown themselves to be utterly selfless throughout all the campaigns, and they cannot be treated as ordinary prisoners of war. They have broken the commandment of God, and their defeat is their punishment. To show them mercy is to prolong the war. Their motto has been absolute unscrupulousness. They have not cared what means they employ in their operations. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The Japanese forces are crusaders in a holy war. Hesitation is uncalled for, and wrongdoers must be wiped out. So you can imagine a lot of this rhetoric is promoting a certain culture in the Japanese military. Their training, like I said, is brutal, deliberately designed to mold them into very capable perpetrators of atrocities. They were taught that the things they were forcing others to endure would likewise be inflicted upon them by their enemies. So it's like a cycle of violence.
I guess maybe because of this really brutal training, it's probably why General Collins had said, right, since he was one of the few commanders who served in both theaters of operation at the divisional level or above. He said like the Germans were, better organized, better trained, better equipped, but no one fought as tenaciously as the Japanese.
Yep. For those who are interested in looking into the matter of why the Japanese were so atrocious during the war, there's a book that's only about this topic. It's called The Knights of Bushido. It's a hard book to stomach. It's a rough one. I've read it multiple times. At the end of the war, General Masahiro Homma attempted to mitigate the harsh treatment of the prisoners and the Filipino civilians, as he was going to be bearing the blunt for the war crimes, despite a lot of evidence indicating that he had never ordered any atrocities to be taken out. And I kind of believe that one. This guy was very sensitive, we'll say that much. After the war, he would face 43 separate charges, but the verdict failed to distinguish amongst them, leaving some doubt as to his guilt. He was convicted of permitting members of his command to commit atrocities. He claimed he was too occupied with the Corregidor campaign, and he was unaware of the death toll from the Bataan Death March until about 2 months after it had taken place. The court sentenced him to death, which Homma accepted with remarkable grace, thanking the 5-member military commission for his treatment during his confinement. He would be executed by firing squad on April the 3rd of 1946. His 2 subordinates, Major General Yoshitaka Kawane and Colonel Kuretaro Hirono, were both hanged in 1948. Very similar to what happened with Yamashita, although for the case of Yamashita, perhaps he might have known more about what was going on. I think in the case of Homma, he didn't.
At least Yamashita would have known more, even though, as we mentioned, it's a certain Colonel Tsuji Masanobu who's really the perpetrator of the violence.
Yeah. Also, Yamashita was aware that Soichi was spying on him, and Yamashita, for lack of better words, was trolling Soichi a lot. He continuously actually fucked with him, so there was that. That ends this episode. There's only going to be one episode after this, which covers the often forgotten battle for Corregidor. Most people finish with the Bataan Death March, but that's not the end at all. And actually, there's a lot of guerrilla actions, that go on well after 42. But I don't think we're going to go into that. At some point, we will talk about the end of the Philippine campaign when, the fighting's in 45, but that's for another tale. But before I leave you, the audience, please consider checking us out on YouTube, as we have many maps, portraits, and even clips, as you got to hear Mr. Dougie MacArthur give his little speech in Australia. And if you'd like to further support the channel, consider checking us out, over at the YouTube membership or on my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Thank you, Gara, for letting me take you hostage. It's been a while since it's been me leading the effort.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think I've earned that after about 5 weeks with the Greco-Persian Wars with Dan. But don't worry, there's another series in the pipeline where I'll be taking you hostage, so
Exactly.
I'm sure we'll return the favor.
Much more to come. So, see you later, guys.